the fertile alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia witnessed humanity's first decisive steps toward complex civilization during the 5th and 4th millennia BCE. This transformation did not occur overnight, but represented a gradual evolution from the preceding Ubaid period, marked by increasingly sophisticated material culture, technological innovation, and social organization that would fundamentally reshape human society. Archaeological evidence from the transition between the Ubaid period and early Sumerian culture reveals a complex process of cultural continuity and innovation. At Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest city in Mesopotamia, excavations have uncovered a remarkable sequence of temple construction spanning this crucial period. The site's earliest levels, dating to around 5000 BCE, show typical Ubaid characteristics: simple mud brick structures with distinctive painted pottery featuring geometric designs in dark paint on buff-coloured clay. However, by 4500 BCE, the archaeological record demonstrates significant changes in both architectural complexity and ritual practice. The temple sequence at Eridu illustrates this transformation dramatically. Temple 7, dating to the late Ubaid period, was a modest rectangular structure measuring approximately 12 by 15 meters, with a simple altar and offering table. By the time of Temple 1, constructed around 3500 BCE, the building had evolved into a massive tripartite structure measuring 23 by 45 meters, elevated on a substantial platform and featuring elaborate buttressed facades, multiple chambers, and sophisticated drainage systems. This architectural evolution reflects not merely improved building techniques, but fundamental changes in religious organization, social hierarchy, and community labor mobilization. Similar patterns emerge at Ur, where deep soundings have revealed continuous occupation from the Ubaid period through the emergence of recognizable Sumerian culture. The pottery assemblages show a gradual shift from the painted Ubaid ceramics to the wheel-made undecorated vessels characteristic of early Sumerian sites. More significantly, the appearance of cylinder seals around 3500 BCE marks a revolutionary development in administrative technology and artistic expression. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate designs and rolled across clay to create impressions, represent the world's first system of personal identification and property marking, essential tools for the complex economic transactions that would characterize urban civilization. The development of permanent settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers required unprecedented innovations in water management and agricultural technology. The natural flooding patterns of these rivers differed significantly from the Nile's predictable annual inundation. Mesopotamian floods occurred in spring when snowmelt from the Anatolian and Zagros mountains reached the lowlands, often arriving at the worst possible time for agriculture when crops were ripening. Early Sumerian communities developed sophisticated irrigation systems to harness these waters effectively while protecting their fields from destructive flooding. Archaeological surveys have identified extensive canal networks dating to this period, including major waterways that diverted river water across vast areas of the southern alluvium. These canals required constant maintenance, coordinated labor efforts, and centralized planning that helped drive the development of complex social institutions. The construction of levees, reservoirs, and distribution channels demanded engineering knowledge that was accumulated and transmitted across generations, creating specialized classes of water managers and canal supervisors. Agricultural innovations accompanied these hydraulic developments. The introduction of the ox-drawn plough around 4000 BCE revolutionized farming productivity allowing cultivation of the heavy clay soils that characterized much of the region. Farmers developed techniques for managing soil salinity, a constant threat in irrigated agriculture, through crop rotation, fallowing, and the cultivation of salt-tolerant plants. The domestication of date palms provided not only a crucial food source but also valuable materials for construction and crafts, while their shade protected other crops from the intense summer heat. These agricultural advances supported dramatic population growth and the concentration of people in permanent settlements. Sites like Uruk, which would become the world's first true city, began as small farming villages but expanded rapidly as improved food production could support non-agricultural specialists. The archaeological record shows increasing craft specialization during this period, with distinct quarters for potters, metalworkers and textile producers appearing in excavated settlements. The formation of proto-urban centers represented a fundamental reorganization of human society. Early Sumerian settlements of the 4th millennium BCE display clear evidence of social stratification that contrasts sharply with the relatively egalitarian communities of earlier periods. Excavations at sites like Tepe Gowra reveal stark differences in burial practices, with some graves containing elaborate grave goods, including precious metals, carved stones, and imported materials, while others hold only simple pottery vessels. Housing patterns provide additional evidence of emerging social hierarchies. At Tel Es-Sarwan and other sites, archaeologists have uncovered large multi-room houses with sophisticated architectural features alongside smaller, simpler dwellings. The larger structures often contained specialized rooms for craft production, storage areas capable of holding substantial surpluses, and reception areas suitable for conducting business or entertaining guests. These buildings likely belonged to emerging merchant families or craft specialists who accumulated wealth through trade or specialized production. The appearance of monumental architecture during this period reflects the ability of these early communities to mobilize large labor forces for collective projects. The construction of major temples, defensive walls, and public buildings required not only numerous workers, but also sophisticated organizational systems to coordinate their efforts. Project managers needed to arrange food supplies for workers, organize tool production and maintenance, and coordinate the activities of different craft specialists. These requirements fostered the development of administrative hierarchies and record-keeping systems that would eventually lead to the invention of writing. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this social transformation. Temples served not only as centers of worship but as economic powerhouses that controlled vast agricultural estates, managed long-distance trade networks, and employed hundreds of workers in various capacities. Temple complexes included workshops for textile production, metalworking and pottery manufacture, granaries for storing agricultural surpluses, and administrative offices where scribes would eventually develop the world's first writing system to track the institution's complex economic activities. The environmental challenges of southern Mesopotamia profoundly shaped early Sumerian development. The region's location in the delta formed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers created a landscape of marshes, lagoons, and seasonal wetlands that presented both opportunities and obstacles for human settlement. The marshy environment provided abundant resources including fish, waterfowl, and reeds, but also posed significant challenges for agriculture and permanent construction. Early Sumerian communities developed innovative solutions to these environmental constraints. They learned to exploit the abundant reed beds that flourished in the wetlands, using these materials for construction, boat building, and craft production. Reed bundles bound with bitumen created waterproof vessels capable of navigating the complex waterways. while woven reed mats served as roofing material and floor coverings. The distinctive architecture of early Mesopotamian temples, with their characteristic buttressed walls, may have evolved from techniques first developed for reed construction. The abundance of clay in the alluvial deposits provided another crucial resource that shaped Sumerian material culture. Unlike regions where stone was readily available for construction and tool-making, southern Mesopotamia's inhabitants became masters of ceramic technology. They developed techniques for producing not only pottery, but also architectural elements, drainage pipes, and eventually the clay tablets that would preserve their written records. The quality of Mesopotamian clay was particularly suitable for detailed modelling, enabling the production of intricate figurines, cylinder seals, and decorative architectural elements. Natural bitumen seeps provided waterproofing materials essential for boat construction, building foundations, and storage containers. This resource gave early Sumerian communities a significant advantage in water management and long-distance transport, enabling them to develop extensive trade networks that would become crucial to their economic development. The combination of navigable waterways and waterproof vessels allowed Mesopotamian merchants to transport goods efficiently across long distances, connecting their communities with sources of raw materials unavailable in the alluvial plain. The scarcity of stone, metal ores, and timber in southern Mesopotamia created powerful incentives for long-distance trade that would profoundly influence Sumerian civilization's development. Communities that successfully organized trade expeditions to obtain these essential materials gained significant advantages over their neighbors, accumulating wealth and prestige that translated into political power. The need to coordinate these complex trading ventures contributed to the development of sophisticated administrative systems and the emergence of merchant classes who would play crucial roles in Sumerian society. Climate patterns during this period generally favoured agricultural development, with relatively stable precipitation levels and river flows that supported intensive cultivation. However, periodic droughts and floods required communities to develop resilient strategies including food storage systems, diversified agricultural practices, and mutual support networks between settlements. These challenges fostered cooperation between communities while also creating competition for limited resources during difficult periods. The gradual shift from egalitarian to hierarchical social structures reflected these environmental and economic pressures. Communities that successfully managed water resources organized effective trade networks, and coordinated large-scale agricultural projects gained advantages that allowed certain families or groups to accumulate wealth and power. Over time, these advantages became institutionalized through religious authority, control of trade routes, and ownership of productive resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that this social transformation was neither uniform nor unchallenged. Some sites show evidence of conflict and destruction during this period, possibly reflecting tensions between different communities or internal struggles over resources and power. The construction of defensive walls around several early urban centres indicates that competition between settlements sometimes escalated to warfare, driving further innovations in military technology and social organisation. The emergence of specialised military classes paralleled other forms of social stratification. Elite burials from this period sometimes contain weapons and military equipment, suggesting that warfare had become sufficiently important to support professional warriors. The development of bronze working technology, initially for tools and ornaments, was quickly adapted for weapon production, giving communities with access to copper and tin sources significant military advantages. The transformation from scattered agricultural settlements to organised city-states represented one of history's most profound political revolutions. By 3500 BCE, the accumulated innovations in agriculture, administration, and social organization had created conditions for entirely new forms of human community. The city-states that emerged during this period established patterns of governance, religious authority, and territorial control that would define Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Uruk stands as the paramount example of this urban revolution. Archaeological excavations have revealed a settlement that grew from approximately 70 hectares around 3800 BCE to over 600 hectares by 3000 BCE, making it the largest human settlement the world had yet seen. The city's massive walls, later celebrated in the Epic of Gilgamesh, enclosed a population estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 inhabitants. Within these walls, distinct neighborhoods housed different social classes and occupational groups, creating the world's first truly urban society. The Anu district at Uruk demonstrates the sophisticated architectural planning that characterized these early cities. The White Temple, constructed around 3200 BCE, rose 13 meters above the surrounding plain on an artificial platform measuring 60 by 80 meters. This structure represented a revolutionary approach to monumental architecture, using standardized mud bricks produced in specialized workshops and assembled by teams of skilled masons. The temple's interior featured a central hall measuring 15 by 35 meters, with carefully planned sightlines that focused attention on the altar where the city's patron deity Anu was believed to reside. Emerged as another major center during this period, distinguished by its strategic location near the Persian Gulf and its control of maritime trade routes. The city's early royal cemetery, dating to around 2900 BCE, provides extraordinary evidence of the wealth and power concentrated in these urban centres. Excavations by Leonard Woolley revealed burial chambers containing hundreds of artefacts crafted from gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials imported from across the known world. The famous golden helmet of Mescalamdug, beaten from a single sheet of electrum and decorated with intricate repousse work, demonstrates the exceptional skill of Ur's craftsmen and the resources available to the city's elite. Lagash developed as a major power controlling the fertile region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The city's patron deity, Ningirsu, was associated with agriculture and warfare, reflecting Lagash's dual focus on intensive farming and military expansion. Archaeological surveys have identified an extensive network of canals radiating from Lagash, some extending over 50 kilometers to bring water to distant agricultural settlements. These hydraulic works required massive labor investments and sophisticated engineering knowledge, demonstrating the organizational capabilities that made city-state governance possible. Nippur occupied a unique position among Sumerian cities as the religious center of the entire region. The city housed the shrine of Enlil, considered the king of the gods in the Sumerian pantheon, making Nippur neutral ground where representatives from different city-states could meet for religious festivals and political negotiations. The Eka temple complex at Nippur covered over 2 hectares and included workshops, administrative offices, and storage facilities that managed the religious activities of multiple city-states. Cuneiform tablets from Nippur's archives record tribute payments from cities across Sumer, indicating the temple's role as a coordinating institution for the entire region. Kish emerged as one of the earlier centers of royal power, with archaeological evidence suggesting organized kingship dating to around 3100 BCE. The city's location in northern Sumer gave it control over trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau and Anatolia. Kish's rulers adopted the title King of Kish, which became synonymous with supremacy over all Sumer. The city's patron deity Zababa was a war god, reflecting Kish's military orientation and its rulers' ambitions for regional dominance. The development of monumental architecture in these cities reflected both religious devotion and political ambition. The evolution from simple temples to massive ziggurats represents one of humanity's first experiments in large-scale construction projects. Early ziggurats began as raised platforms designed to elevate temples above flood levels and bring them closer to the heavens where the gods were believed to dwell. The White Temple at Uruk, built on its artificial mountain, established the basic pattern that would be elaborated in later centuries. Construction techniques developed rapidly during this period as builders learned to manage increasingly ambitious projects. Standardized brick sizes allowed for efficient production and assembly, while the use of bitumen mortar provided waterproofing essential in the marshy environment. Builders developed sophisticated drainage systems to prevent water damage, including networks of ceramic pipes that channeled rainwater away from foundations. The buttressed walls, characteristic of Mesopotamian architecture, served both structural and aesthetic purposes, providing additional support for tall buildings while creating the distinctive play of light and shadow that made these structures visible from great distances across the flat alluvium. Temple complexes became the economic hearts of their cities, controlling vast agricultural estates worked by dependent labourers. The Yana complex at Uruk covered 9 hectares and included dozens of buildings serving different functions. Workshops produced textiles, metalwork and pottery both for local use and export trade. Administrative offices housed the scribes who developed cuneiform writing to track the complex economic transactions that flowed through the temple. Storage facilities could hold thousands of tons of grain, oil and other commodities that formed the basis of the temple's wealth and power. The establishment of kingship represented a fundamental transformation in political organization. Early Sumerian kings combined religious, military and administrative functions in ways that had no precedent in human history. Archaeological evidence from royal burials suggests that kings were buried with elaborate grave goods and sometimes with retainers who were killed to accompany them into the afterlife, indicating beliefs about divine kingship that elevated rulers far above ordinary mortals. The concept of divine mandate provided ideological justification for royal authority. Sumerian kings claimed to rule as representatives of the gods, chosen by divine will to maintain order and prosperity. This belief system appears in the earliest written records, including the Sumerian king list, which describes how kingship descended from heaven and was passed from one city to another according to divine preference. While this document was compiled much later, it preserves traditions about early rulers that may reflect genuine historical memories. Gilgamesh of Uruk stands as the most famous of these early kings, though separating historical fact from later legend presents significant challenges. Archaeological evidence confirms that a king named Gilgamesh ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE, during a period when the city was expanding its territorial control and engaging in conflicts with neighbouring states. The historical Gilgamesh appears to have been a successful military leader who strengthened Uruk's walls and extended the city's influence over surrounding settlements. Later, traditions transformed him into a semi-divine hero whose adventures became the subject of the world's first great literary epic. Other early rulers left more concrete historical traces. In Megacities of Kish, mentioned in contemporary inscriptions from around 2700 BCE, appears to have exercised authority over multiple city-states and led military campaigns against Elam. His son Aga is recorded as having besieged Uruk, providing one of the earliest documented conflicts between Sumerian city-states. These conflicts established patterns of intercity warfare that would characterize Mesopotamian politics for centuries. The legendary king lists preserve names of rulers whose historical existence remains uncertain, but whose inclusion suggests they were remembered as significant figures. These lists typically organize early kings into dynasties associated with particular cities, indicating that political power was understood to shift from one urban center to another over time. The concept of hegemony, where one city-state exercised authority over others while allowing them to maintain local autonomy, appears to have developed during this period as a solution to the practical difficulties of governing multiple urban centers. Political relationships between city-states evolved from simple trade partnerships to complex systems of alliance, tribute, and territorial control. Early confederations appear to have formed around shared religious practices, with cities contributing to the maintenance of major temples and participating in regional festivals. These religious connections provided frameworks for political cooperation and conflict resolution that helped prevent constant warfare between neighbouring settlements. Trade networks created another dimension of intercity relationships. Cities that controlled key trade routes or possessed specialised resources could leverage these advantages to gain political influence over their neighbours. Ur's position near the Persian Gulf made it a crucial link between Mesopotamia and the outside world, while cities like Lagash used their agricultural productivity to support larger populations and more powerful armies. Territorial boundaries between city-states were often defined by control over irrigation systems rather than simple geographic features. Cities that could extend their canal networks could claim authority over newly irrigated lands, leading to complex disputes over water rights and agricultural territories. Archaeological surveys have identified numerous small settlements that appear to have shifted allegiance between different city-states depending on which urban centre controlled the canals that supplied their fields. Military technology advanced rapidly as competition between city-states intensified. Bronze weapons became more sophisticated, with specialised designs for different types of combat. The development of the war chariot around 2900 BCE revolutionised battlefield tactics and created new opportunities for displaying royal power. Elite warriors equipped with bronze weapons and riding in decorated chariots became symbols of their city's strength and their rulers' divine favour. Fortification systems grew increasingly elaborate as cities invested in defensive architecture. The walls of Uruk, rebuilt multiple times during this period, eventually reached a length of 9.5 kilometres and enclosed the entire urban area. These massive constructions required coordinated labour from thousands of workers and demonstrated the organisational capabilities that distinguish city-states from simpler forms of political organisation. The construction and maintenance of city walls became civic duties that bound inhabitants to their urban communities and created shared identities that transcended kinship ties. The emergence of professional armies marked another crucial development in city-state organisation. Early kings maintained personal retinues of warriors who served as bodyguards, military commanders, and enforcers of royal authority. These professional soldiers were equipped with standardized weapons and armor, trained in coordinated tactics, and supported by the economic resources of their cities' temples and palaces. The development of military hierarchies paralleled the growth of administrative bureaucracies, creating institutional structures that could survive individual rulers and maintain continuity across generations. Diplomatic practices developed as city-states learned to manage their relationships through negotiation as well as warfare. Early treaties recorded on clay tablets established boundaries, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts between different cities. Marriage alliances between ruling families created kinship ties that could prevent conflicts or provide justification for military intervention. The exchange of diplomatic gifts, often including precious objects crafted by skilled artisans, demonstrated wealth and power while creating obligations between rulers. The administrative demands of managing increasingly complex temple economies and city-state bureaucracies created pressures that would lead to humanity's most transformative intellectual breakthrough. In the cramped accounting offices of Uruk's Iana temple complex, scribes wrestling with the challenge of tracking thousands of economic transactions developed the world's first writing system around 3200 BCE. This innovation emerged not from a sudden inspiration, but through the gradual evolution of existing record-keeping methods that had served Mesopotamian communities for centuries. Archaeological excavations at Uruk have uncovered over 5,000 archaic tablets from the earliest phases of writing, providing unprecedented insight into this revolutionary development. These tablets, found in sealed contexts within the temple precincts, reveal a system already sophisticated enough to record complex economic data, including quantities of grain, numbers of livestock, areas of cultivated land, and the names of responsible officials. The tablets' find spots within specific rooms of the temple complex indicate that writing emerged as a practical solution to the information management crisis facing large institutions rather than as an abstract intellectual exercise. The immediate precursors to cuneiform writing can be traced through various token systems that had been used for accounting purposes since the 8th millennium BCE. Simple clay tokens representing different commodities, spheres for grain measures, cylinders for livestock, cones for specific quantities, had long served merchants and administrators throughout the Near East. By 3500 BCE, these tokens were often enclosed in hollow clay envelopes called bullae, with the token shapes impressed on the envelope's exterior to indicate contents without breaking the seal. The logical next step involved abandoning the tokens entirely and simply impressing their shapes directly onto flat clay surfaces, creating the first true written records. Proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk demonstrate this transition clearly. Early signs closely resembled the physical objects they represented. A pictograph of a bull's head indicated cattle, a circle with internal marks represented different types of grain, and human figures denoted workers or officials. These pictographic elements were combined with numerical notation systems that could express precise quantities, creating records of remarkable specificity. Tablet W9579 plus AI from the Uruk archives records the transfer of 135,000 litres of barley, 30,000 litres of wheat, and 4,500 litres of oil, demonstrating the scale of economic activity that necessitated written documentation. The physical process of creating these early tablets reveals important details about scribal practice and the development of writing technology. Scribes used fresh clay prepared to specific consistency, forming rectangular tablets typically measuring 6-8 centimeters in length. The writing implement was a reed stylus cut to create different tip shapes for various types of marks. Early scribes drew curved lines and detailed pictographs, but the practical difficulties of creating smooth curves in clay led to the angular, wedge-shaped impressions that gave cuneiform its distinctive appearance and modern name. The evolution from pictographic representation to abstract symbolic notation occurred remarkably quickly, suggesting intensive experimentation by early scribes. Within 2 centuries of the first written tablets, the system had developed phonetic elements that could represent sounds rather than just concrete objects. This breakthrough allowed scribes to record proper names, abstract concepts, and grammatical elements that pure pictography could not express. The sign for arrow could represent not only the weapon itself but also the syllable tai, in other words. enabling the writing system to capture the full complexity of spoken language. Sumerian emerged as the world's first written language through this process, preserving for posterity a linguistic system unlike any other known to scholars. The language belongs to no established language family, making it a true isolate with no demonstrable relatives among the world's documented languages. This isolation has complicated efforts to understand Sumerian fully, as comparative linguistics cannot illuminate its structure through related languages. However, the abundance of cuneiform texts spanning over 2 millennia provides extensive documentation of Sumerian grammar, vocabulary, and usage patterns. The agglutinative structure of Sumerian distinguished it from the inflectional patterns familiar from Indo-European languages. Sumerian built complex meanings by attaching strings of morphemes to root words, creating elaborate verbal and nominal forms that could express precise relationships between actions, objects, and participants. A single Sumerian verb could incorporate elements indicating subject, object, tense, aspect, mood, and various spatial and temporal relationships, resulting in words that might require entire sentences to translate accurately into English. The writing system's development paralleled the language's grammatical complexity, with scribes creating sophisticated methods for representing Sumerian's agglutinative morphology. Different cuneiform signs could function as logograms representing entire words, syllabograms representing sound values, or determinatives providing semantic categories for ambiguous terms. This multi-layered system allowed scribes to write Sumerian with remarkable precision, while also adapting the script for use with other languages as Mesopotamian civilization expanded. Early Sumerian texts reveal a vocabulary deeply rooted in the agricultural and administrative concerns of temple communities. Terms for different types of grain, measures of capacity and area, categories of livestock, and ranks of temple personnel appear frequently in the earliest tablets. Religious vocabulary was equally prominent, with detailed terminology for ritual activities, offerings, festivals, and divine attributes. The precision of this specialized vocabulary indicates that Sumerian had already developed sophisticated registers for different domains of activity before the advent of writing. The expansion of writing beyond purely administrative functions occurred gradually as scribes recognized the technology's broader potential. Religious texts represent the earliest non-economic use of cuneiform, with hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions appearing in temple archives by 2900 BCE. These texts reveal that Sumerian possessed a rich oral tradition of religious poetry that scribes began transcribing once writing technology became sufficiently developed to capture literary language. Legal applications of writing emerged as city-states developed more complex judicial systems. Early legal texts include records of court proceedings, property transfers, and contractual agreements that required permanent documentation. The Code of Urnamu, dating to around 2100 BCE but preserving much earlier legal traditions, demonstrates how written law could provide consistent standards for judicial decisions across different communities. These legal texts established precedents for written jurisprudence that would influence legal systems throughout the ancient world. Historical recording represented another significant expansion of writing's applications. Early chronicles recorded the reigns of kings, major military campaigns, and significant religious events, creating the first systematic attempts to preserve historical memory through written documentation. The Sumerian king list, though compiled much later, draws on traditions that may ultimately derive from contemporary records kept in temple and palace archives. These historical texts established narrative patterns and chronological frameworks that would shape historical writing for millennia. Literary compositions marked the culmination of writing's evolution, from administrative tool to medium for artistic expression. The earliest Sumerian literary texts, including hymns to various deities and narrative poems about legendary heroes, demonstrate sophisticated poetic techniques, including parallelism, alliteration, and complex metaphorical language. These works required scribes to develop methods for representing the rhythmic and aesthetic qualities of oral poetry in written form, pushing the writing system to new levels of expressiveness. The emergence of scribal schools reflected the growing importance of literacy in Sumerian society and the need for systematic training in writing technology. Archaeological evidence from Nippur, Ur, and other major centres reveals purpose-built school buildings equipped with benches for students and storage areas for practice tablets. These institutions, known as edubba, provided comprehensive education in writing, mathematics, literature, and religious knowledge for young men destined for administrative careers. Scribal education followed a rigorous curriculum that began with basic sign recognition and progressed through increasingly complex exercises. Students copied standard lists of cuneiform signs, practiced writing their own names and common words, and eventually graduated to transcribing literary and religious texts. Hundreds of practice tablets from Nippur's scribal schools preserve student exercises, including spelling mistakes, corrections by teachers, and evidence of the pedagogical methods used to transmit literacy skills. The social status of scribes reflected writing's crucial importance in Sumerian civilization. Professional scribes enjoyed high social standing, often serving as advisors to kings and high-ranking temple officials. Scribal families frequently maintained their positions across multiple generations, creating hereditary classes of literate specialists who controlled access to written knowledge. The god Nabu, patron deity of scribes, occupied an important position in the Sumerian pantheon, indicating the religious significance attributed to writing and literacy. Specialized scribal roles developed as writing applications diversified. Temple scribes focused on religious texts and economic records, while palace scribes handled diplomatic correspondence and administrative documents. Legal scribes specialized in contracts and court records, developing expertise in the complex formulas required for different types of legal transactions. Military scribes accompanied armies on campaign, recording battle outcomes and managing logistical supplies. This specialization created distinct scribal traditions with their own technical vocabularies and documentary practices. The limited nature of literacy in Sumerian society had profound implications for social organization and cultural transmission. Estimates suggest that fewer than 1% of the population could read and write, making scribes essential intermediaries between the literate elite and the broader community. This literacy gap reinforced existing social hierarchies while creating new forms of power based on control of written information. Kings and high priests relied on scribes to manage their affairs, but this dependence also made scribes potentially influential political actors in their own right. The concentration of literacy within temple and palace institutions meant that written knowledge was closely associated with religious and political authority. Sacred texts were literally sacred, accessible only to qualified priests and scribes who had undergone proper training and initiation. This restriction helped maintain the mystery and authority of religious institutions, while ensuring that crucial knowledge remained under institutional control rather than circulating freely among the population. The physical nature of cuneiform writing on clay tablets created unique challenges and opportunities for information management. Clay tablets were durable and fireproof, allowing archives to survive disasters that would destroy papyrus or parchment documents. However, tablets were also heavy and bulky, making large archives difficult to transport or reorganize. scribes developed sophisticated filing systems using numbered series, standardized formats, and cross-reference tablets to manage these unwieldy archives effectively. The economic impact of writing technology extended far beyond simple record keeping. Written contracts enabled more complex business relationships, allowing merchants to engage in long-distance trade with greater security and precision. Standardized measures and weights could be recorded and verified, reducing disputes and facilitating commerce between different cities. Agricultural management became more efficient as written records allowed administrators to track crop yields, plan planting schedules, and optimize resource allocation across large estates. Writing also transformed the nature of religious practice by enabling the preservation and standardization of ritual texts. Priests could ensure that ceremonies were performed correctly by consulting written instructions, while hymns and prayers could be transmitted accurately across generations without the distortions inevitable in purely oral tradition. This standardization helped create more unified religious practices across different Sumerian cities while preserving ancient traditions that might otherwise have been forgotten. The development of mathematical notation as part of the cuneiform system enabled advances in calculation and measurement that supported increasingly sophisticated engineering and architectural projects. Scribes could record precise measurements for canal construction, calculate areas and volumes for agricultural planning, and maintain accurate accounts of complex transactions involving multiple commodities and exchange rates. These mathematical capabilities were essential for managing the large-scale projects that characterized Sumerian civilization. The mastery of writing technology transformed Sumerian civilization into something entirely unprecedented in human history. By 2900 BCE, the administrative innovations that had begun in temple complexes had evolved into sophisticated governmental systems capable of managing increasingly complex political entities. The early dynastic period witnessed the crystallization of distinctly Mesopotamian approaches to governance, warfare, and cultural expression that would influence civilizations across the ancient world for millennia to come. Political organization during this era reflected the unique challenges of governing urban populations while maintaining control over extensive agricultural territories. The dual leadership structure that emerged combined religious authority with secular administration in ways that balanced divine legitimacy against practical governing needs. The Ensi, traditionally translated as governor or priest-king, served as the primary religious leader of each city-state while simultaneously managing its economic and administrative functions. These officials traced their authority directly to the patron deity of their city, presenting themselves as earthly representatives chosen to implement divine will in human affairs. Archaeological evidence from Lagash provides exceptional insight into the Ensi system through the extensive archives of Enmetina, who ruled around 2430 BCE. His cuneiform records detail the complex responsibilities that define this office, managing temple estates covering thousands of hectares, overseeing irrigation systems that served dozens of settlements, coordinating craft production in workshops employing hundreds of specialists, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with neighbouring city-states. Enmetina's inscriptions describe his role in religious terms, emphasizing his selection by the god Ningirsu and his responsibility for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual observance and just governance. The Lugal, literally meaning big man, represented a parallel but distinct form of leadership that emphasized military prowess and territorial expansion. Unlike the Ensi, whose authority derived primarily from religious legitimacy, the Lugal achieved power through successful warfare and the ability to protect his city from external threats. This office appears to have emerged during periods of intensified conflict between city-states. when communities needed leaders capable of organizing effective military responses to external aggression. The Lugal's authority was more personal and charismatic than institutional, depending on continued military success to maintain legitimacy. The relationship between these two forms of leadership varied significantly across different city-states and historical periods. In some cities, the same individual held both titles, combining religious and military authority in a single person. Gudea of Lagash, who ruled around 2144 BCE, exemplified this dual role through his extensive building projects and military campaigns, presenting himself simultaneously as Ningirsu's chosen representative and as a victorious war leader. His numerous statues, carved from imported diorite and placed throughout Lagash's temples, depicted him in both priestly robes and military regalia, visually reinforcing his claim to comprehensive authority. Other city-states maintained clearer distinctions between religious and secular leadership, with Ensi officials focusing on temple administration and ritual duties, while Lugal leaders handled military and diplomatic affairs. This division of responsibilities appears to have been particularly common in larger cities, where the complexity of governance exceeded what any single individual could effectively manage. Cuneiform tablets from Ur's archives record extensive correspondence between different officials responsible for various aspects of city administration, indicating sophisticated bureaucratic systems that distributed authority among multiple specialized administrators. The emergence of royal dynasties during this period reflected efforts to institutionalize successful leadership patterns and ensure stable succession. The concept of hereditary kingship, where political authority passed from father to son, represented a significant departure from earlier practices where leaders were chosen based on personal qualities or divine selection. Archaeological evidence from royal cemeteries at Ur demonstrates the elaborate rituals surrounding dynastic succession, with burial practices that emphasize continuity between deceased and living rulers, while reinforcing the divine nature of royal authority. The famous Royal Cemetery of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained 16 royal burials dating to approximately 2600 to 2400 BCE that provide extraordinary evidence of early dynastic political organization and social stratification. The tomb of Queen Puabi, identified by a cylinder seal bearing her name and title, contained her body adorned with an elaborate golden headdress consisting of golden leaves, flowers, and ribbons, along with large golden earrings and multiple necklaces of gold and lapis lazuli beads. 74 attendants were buried with her, including soldiers wearing copper helmets and carrying spears, court ladies dressed in red robes with golden hair ribbons, musicians holding lyres decorated with golden bullheads, and ox-drawn chariots complete with their drivers and grooms. These mass burials indicate beliefs about royal authority that extended beyond earthly life into the afterworld, suggesting that early dynastic kings and queens were understood to maintain their political relationships and administrative responsibilities even after death. The careful arrangement of the attendants in Puabi's tomb, with each group positioned according to their specific roles and social ranks, mirrors the hierarchical organization of living court society and demonstrates the elaborate ceremonial protocols that surrounded royal authority during this period. Intercity conflicts intensified dramatically during the early dynastic period as population growth and territorial expansion brought neighbouring city-states into increasingly direct competition for limited resources. The rivalry between Lagash Nama over control of the Gu-Edin territory exemplifies the complex political and economic factors that drove these conflicts. The Gu-Edin, a fertile plain located between the two cities, contained some of the region's most productive agricultural land, along with crucial water sources that both cities needed to maintain their irrigation systems. Contemporary inscriptions from both cities provide detailed accounts of this prolonged conflict, revealing sophisticated diplomatic and military strategies employed by early dynastic rulers. Earnatum of Lagash, who ruled around 2450 BCE, commissioned the famous Stele of the Vultures to commemorate his victory over Umma's forces in this territorial dispute. The limestone monument, standing over 1.8 meters tall, depicts Earnatum leading his troops into battle while vultures devour the corpses of defeated enemies. The accompanying cuneiform inscription describes the conflict's religious dimensions, presenting the battle as divinely ordained punishment for Umma's violation of sacred boundary agreements established by the gods themselves. The military tactics depicted on the Stele of the Vultures reveal significant developments in early dynastic warfare technology and organization. Earnatum's soldiers advance in tight formation, carrying large rectangular shields and long spears, with their overlapping shields creating an impenetrable wall of bronze-reinforced leather. This phalanx formation required extensive training and discipline to maintain effectiveness, indicating the development of professional military units rather than hastily assembled citizen militias. The soldiers wear standardized leather skirts and copper helmets, suggesting centralized production of military equipment and systematic approaches to army organization. The conflict's resolution through the Treaty of Entemena demonstrates the sophisticated diplomatic practices that had evolved to manage intercity relationships. This agreement, recorded on clay tablets found in both cities' archives, established precise territorial boundaries marked by stone monuments and irrigation channels, created mechanisms for resolving future disputes through arbitration rather than warfare, and instituted regular tribute payments from Umma to Lagash as compensation for past violations. The treaty's religious language, invoking multiple deities as witnesses and guarantors, reflects the integration of diplomatic and religious practices that characterized early dynastic international relations. Similar conflicts erupted throughout Sumer as city-states competed for control over trade routes, water resources, and agricultural territories. The struggle between Kish and Uruk for supremacy over northern and southern Sumer involved multiple military campaigns spanning several generations. Inscriptions from both cities record victories and defeats in this ongoing rivalry, with control shifting back and forth as different rulers achieved temporary advantages through superior military organization or strategic alliances with neighboring powers. These territorial conflicts drove rapid innovations in military technology and fortification systems. Bronze weapons became increasingly sophisticated, with specialized designs for different combat roles. Socketed spearheads provided stronger attachment to wooden shafts, while improved bronze working techniques enabled the production of longer, more effective sword blades. The development of composite bows constructed from wood, horn, and sinew dramatically increased the range and penetrating power of archery units, forcing corresponding improvements in armor and shield design. Siege warfare emerged as city-states learned to attack fortified positions rather than simply engaging in open-field battles. Archaeological evidence from several early dynastic sites shows destruction layers associated with successful sieges, including evidence of battering rams used against city gates and scaling ladders employed to overcome defensive walls. The development of siege techniques required new forms of military engineering and logistics, as attacking armies needed to maintain themselves in hostile territory for extended periods while conducting complex operations against prepared defences. The cultural achievements of the early dynastic period reflected the wealth and sophistication that political stability and territorial control made possible. artistic production reached new levels of technical excellence and aesthetic refinement as royal and temple patrons commissioned increasingly elaborate works to demonstrate their power and piety. The Standard of Ur, discovered in the royal cemetery and dating to approximately 2600 BCE, exemplifies the artistic mastery achieved by Sumerian craftsmen during this golden age. The standard consists of two rectangular panels measuring 21.5 by 49.5 centimeters, constructed from wood and decorated with elaborate mosaic work using lapis lazuli, red limestone, and shell set in bitumen. One panel depicts scenes of war, showing Sumerian soldiers in battle formation, enemy prisoners being led away, and the king receiving captives from his victorious troops. The other panel illustrates peace, with processions of figures carrying fish, livestock, and other offerings toward a banquet scene where nobles drink from golden cups, while musicians play lyres and harps. The standard's artistic technique demonstrates the sophisticated craft traditions that had developed in Sumerian workshops. The tiny pieces of stone and shell, some no larger than rice grains, were cut and shaped with extraordinary precision before being fitted together to create complex figurative scenes. The artist employed sophisticated understanding of perspective and proportion, arranging figures in registers that clearly communicate narrative sequences while maintaining aesthetic balance and visual harmony. The contrast between the military and peaceful scenes reflects early dynastic concepts of royal responsibility, emphasizing both the king's role as military protector and his duty to ensure prosperity and abundance for his subjects. Sculpture during this period achieved unprecedented naturalism and emotional expressiveness. The numerous votive statues discovered at Tel Asmar, dating to around 2700 to 2500 BCE, display remarkable individuality, despite following conventional artistic formulas. These figures, ranging in height from 21 to 72 centimeters, were carved from gypsum, limestone, and other stones, then placed in temples as permanent worshippers who would pray continuously on behalf of their donors. Each statue displays distinctive facial features, hairstyles, and clothing details that suggest attempts at actual portraiture rather than generic representation. The technical quality of early dynastic sculpture required sophisticated understanding of stone carving techniques and access to high-quality raw materials. Many statues were carved from imported stones, including diorite from Oman and limestone from the Zagros Mountains, indicating extensive trade networks that supplied Sumerian workshops with specialized materials. The smooth surfaces and precise details achieved by Sumerian sculptors demonstrate mastery of bronze and copper tools specifically designed for stone carving, along with abrasive techniques using sand and other materials to achieve final polish. Metalworking reached extraordinary levels of sophistication during the early dynastic period, with craftsmen developing techniques that would not be surpassed for centuries. The golden objects from Ur's royal cemetery demonstrate mastery of virtually every metalworking technique known to the ancient world. Queen Puabi's headdress required skills in sheet metal working, repousse decoration, filigree wire work, and granulation techniques that created complex textures and patterns. The famous golden helmet of Mes-Kalamdug was beaten from a single sheet of electrum and decorated with elaborate hair patterns that required hundreds of individual hammer blows to achieve the desired relief effects. Bronze working advanced significantly as Sumerian smiths learned to control alloy compositions for different applications. Weapons required hard, sharp edges that could be achieved through specific tin-copper ratios and careful heat treatment, while decorative objects needed softer alloys that could be worked into complex shapes without cracking. The development of lost wax casting techniques enabled the production of intricate bronze objects including figurines, ritual vessels, and architectural elements that would have been impossible to create through hammering alone. Cylinder seal production became increasingly sophisticated as these objects evolved from simple administrative tools into complex works of art. Early dynastic seals display remarkable technical virtuosity, with microscopic details carved into stones no larger than a human thumb. The scenes depicted on these seals provide invaluable evidence of early dynastic religious beliefs, mythological traditions, and social practices. Many seals show elaborate banquet scenes with figures drinking from cups while seated at tables laden with food, reflecting the importance of ceremonial feasting in Sumerian social and religious life. The religious practices that flourished during the early dynastic period combined ancient Mesopotamian traditions with new theological developments that reflected the political complexity of city-state civilization. The Sumerian pantheon expanded significantly during this era, as local deities from different cities were incorporated into increasingly comprehensive religious systems. Anu, the sky god associated with Uruk, was recognized as the supreme deity throughout Sumer, while Enlil of Nippur controlled the earth and atmosphere. Enki, patron of Eridu, governed fresh water and wisdom, making him particularly important for agricultural communities dependent on irrigation. Each major city maintained its own patron deity who was understood to own the city and its territory as personal property. Marduk belonged to Babylon, Ningirsu to Lagash, Nana to Ur, and Inanna to Uruk, creating divine personalities that reflected their city's particular characteristics and concerns. These patron deities were housed in elaborate temple complexes that served as their earthly residences, complete with private chambers, reception halls, and service areas staffed by hundreds of priests and attendants. Temple rituals became increasingly elaborate as priests developed sophisticated ceremonial practices designed to maintain proper relationships between human communities and their divine patrons. Daily services included multiple offerings of food, drink, incense, and music, with priests dressing the deity's statue in fine clothing and jewellery before presenting meals that were later distributed to temple personnel and worshippers. Major festivals involved entire cities in processions, sacrifices, and celebrations that could last for days and required months of preparation. The composition of early literary works during this period preserved mythological traditions that would profoundly influence later Mesopotamian culture. The earliest versions of stories that would eventually become part of the Epic of Gilgamesh appear in early dynastic cuneiform tablets, including tales of Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu and their adventures against various monsters and divine opponents. These early literary compositions demonstrate sophisticated narrative techniques, including dialogue, character development, and complex plot structures that established patterns for subsequent literary traditions. Religious architecture reached new levels of monumentality as cities competed to honour their patron deities with increasingly impressive temple complexes. The White Temple at Uruk was rebuilt multiple times during the early dynastic period, with each reconstruction adding height, decorative elements, and additional chambers. The final version stood nearly 40 metres above the surrounding plain and could be seen from distances of over 30 kilometres, serving as a visible symbol of Uruk's power and piety that dominated the entire regional landscape. The sophisticated city-state system that had flourished for nearly 6 centuries faced its greatest challenge when Sargon of Akkad emerged from the northern Mesopotamian city of Kish around 2334 BCE. Unlike the Sumerian rulers who had preceded him, Sargon represented a fundamentally different approach to political organisation, one that would transform the entire concept of governance in the ancient world. His origins remain shrouded in legend, with later texts describing his humble birth and miraculous survival as an infant abandoned in a reed basket on the Euphrates River. but contemporary inscriptions reveal a more prosaic reality of a capable administrator who rose through the ranks of Kish's bureaucracy before seizing power through military coup. Sargon's initial campaigns targeted the weakened Sumerian city-states that had exhausted themselves through generations of internecine warfare. Lugal-Zagersi of Uruk had recently achieved temporary dominance over much of Sumer, but his empire proved brittle when confronted by Sargon's disciplined forces. The Akkadian king's military innovations proved decisive in these early conflicts. His armies employed composite bows that could penetrate bronze armor at ranges exceeding 200 meters, while his infantry formations utilized standardized bronze weapons produced in centralized workshops rather than the varied equipment typical of Sumerian forces. The siege of Uruk demonstrated Sargon's sophisticated understanding of both military engineering and psychological warfare. Rather than attempting costly direct assaults against the city's massive walls, Akkadian forces systematically destroyed the irrigation canals that supplied Uruk's agricultural hinterland, forcing the population to choose between surrender and starvation. This strategy proved devastatingly effective against cities whose prosperity depended entirely on intensive irrigation agriculture. Within months, Uruk's gates opened to Akkadian forces, and Lugal-Zagersi found himself paraded in chains through the streets of Nippur as a demonstration of Sargon's victory over traditional Sumerian authority. The conquest of Lagash required different tactics due to the city's strategic position between major rivers and its reputation for military prowess. Sargon's forces constructed a series of fortified camps that gradually tightened around the city, while Akkadian engineers diverted river channels to flood Lagash's defensive positions. The siege lasted nearly 2 years, during which Sargon demonstrated the logistical capabilities that distinguished his military organization from earlier Mesopotamian armies. Supply columns protected by mobile cavalry units maintained his forces throughout the extended campaign, while specialized siege equipment including battering rams and scaling towers enabled systematic attacks against Lagash's fortifications. The fall of Ur marked the completion of Sargon's conquest of traditional Sumer. The city's surrender came after its ruling elite witnessed the destruction of Uruk and Lagash, recognizing that resistance would only invite similar devastation. Sargon's treatment of Ur revealed his sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. Rather than destroying the city's economic infrastructure, he incorporated Ur's merchant networks into his expanding empire, while replacing local rulers with Akkadian governors who reported directly to his central administration. The creation of the world's first multi-ethnic empire required administrative innovations that went far beyond traditional city-state governance. Sargon established a centralized bureaucracy headquartered in his new capital city of Akkad, whose precise location remains unknown to archaeologists, but which served as the administrative heart of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. This bureaucracy employed standardized procedures for tax collection, legal administration, and military recruitment that could be applied across diverse populations, speaking different languages and following different cultural traditions. Akkadian administrative tablets from sites across the empire reveal the sophisticated record-keeping systems that made centralized control possible. Provincial governors submitted regular reports detailing agricultural production, population counts, military resources, and local political conditions. These reports were compiled by teams of scribes who created comprehensive databases tracking the empire's human and material resources. The scale of this administrative undertaking dwarfed anything previously attempted in human history, requiring thousands of trained personnel and standardized procedures that could function across vast distances and cultural differences. The integration of Akkadian and Sumerian cultural traditions created a unique synthesis that would define Mesopotamian civilization for the next 2 millennia. Sargon's court scribes adapted the cuneiform writing system to record the Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue fundamentally different from Sumerian in its grammatical structure and vocabulary. This adaptation required significant innovations in the use of cuneiform signs, as Akkadian's inflectional morphology differed dramatically from Sumerian's agglutinative patterns. Scribes developed new conventions for representing Akkadian phonemes that had no equivalent in Sumerian, while maintaining traditional logographic uses for concepts shared between the two languages. The preservation of Sumerian religious practices under Akkadian rule reflected both practical political considerations and genuine cultural appreciation. Sargon and his successors understood that their empire's stability depended on maintaining the loyalty of Sumerian populations, who had been governed by their traditional deities for centuries. Rather than imposing Akkadian religious practices, the new rulers presented themselves as legitimate successors to Sumerian kingship, chosen by the same gods who had previously selected native rulers. This strategy required detailed knowledge of Sumerian religious traditions and careful attention to proper ritual observances. Archaeological evidence from Nippur demonstrates the continuity of Sumerian religious practices under Akkadian administration. The Ekur temple complex continued to receive royal patronage, with Akkadian kings commissioning new construction projects and endowing the priesthood with extensive land grants. Cuneiform tablets from the temple archives record the participation of Akkadian officials in traditional Sumerian festivals, including the annual Akitu celebration that renewed divine kingship through elaborate ceremonial reenactments of cosmic creation myths. The economic transformations that accompanied Akkadian rule created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Sargon's military campaigns had secured control over major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, the Levant and the Iranian plateau, enabling Akkadian merchants to operate across vast territories without the political fragmentation that had previously complicated commercial relationships. Standardized weights and measures implemented throughout the empire facilitated trade by eliminating the confusion that had resulted from different cities using incompatible measurement systems. Akkadian commercial practices revealed in cuneiform archives from sites like Kanesh in Anatolia demonstrate the sophisticated business methods that developed under imperial administration. Merchant families established permanent trading posts in distant cities, maintained by agents who handled local transactions while reporting to home offices through regular correspondence. These commercial networks dealt in bulk commodities including metals, textiles and agricultural products, but also luxury goods like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedarwood from Lebanon that were distributed throughout the empire's urban centres. The military organisation that made Akkadian expansion possible represented significant innovations in warfare technology and tactics. Sargon's armies included substantial numbers of professional soldiers rather than the citizen militias that had characterised earlier Mesopotamian warfare. These professionals received standardised equipment, regular training and systematic support that enabled sustained military operations far from their home territories. Archaeological evidence from Akkadian military sites reveals bronze weapons produced in centralized armories, standardized armor designs, and logistical systems capable of supplying armies during extended campaigns. The development of cavalry units marked a particularly significant military innovation. While earlier Mesopotamian armies had used donkey-drawn chariots for battlefield mobility, Akkadian forces employed mounted archers who could harass enemy formations and pursue retreating forces with unprecedented effectiveness. These cavalry tactics proved especially valuable in the empire's frontier regions. where traditional infantry formations were less effective against nomadic opponents who relied on mobility and knowledge of local terrain. Akkadian siege warfare capabilities exceeded anything previously seen in Mesopotamian conflicts. Military engineers developed sophisticated techniques for undermining city walls, including the construction of tunnels that could collapse defensive structures or provide concealed access to besieged cities. Siege towers constructed from wood and bronze enabled attacking forces to reach the tops of defensive walls, while improved battering rams could breach gates that had previously been considered impregnable. The reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, who ruled from 2254 to 2218 BCE, marked the height of Akkadian power and cultural achievement. His military campaigns extended Akkadian control into previously unconquered territories, including the Zagros Mountains and parts of Anatolia, while his domestic policies consolidated the administrative innovations initiated by his predecessors. The famous Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, carved from pink sandstone and standing over 2 meters tall, depicts the king leading his troops up a mountain slope while enemy soldiers fall beneath his feet and divine stars shine overhead, symbolizing celestial approval of his conquests. Naram-Sin's assumption of divine kingship represented a radical departure from traditional Mesopotamian concepts of royal authority. Earlier rulers, including Sargon himself, had claimed divine selection and support but maintained their essential humanity. Naram-Sin declared himself a god, demanding worship from his subjects and commissioning temples dedicated to his own cult. This theological innovation reflected the unprecedented power that Akkadian kings wielded over their vast territories, but it also created tensions with traditional religious establishments that had never acknowledged living rulers as divine beings. The cultural flowering that occurred under Naram-Sin's patronage produced some of the finest artistic achievements in Mesopotamian history. Royal workshops created bronze sculptures of extraordinary technical sophistication, including the famous bronze head discovered at Nineveh that may represent Naram-Sin himself. This masterpiece demonstrates complete mastery of lost wax casting techniques, with intricate details including individual hair strands and facial features that suggest genuine portraiture rather than idealized representation. The gradual weakening of Akkadian power during the late 23rd century BCE resulted from multiple factors including climate change, internal rebellions, and external invasions. Paleoclimatic evidence indicates that the region experienced severe drought conditions around 2200 BCE, disrupting the agricultural production that supported the empire's urban populations and military forces. Cuneiform texts from this period record crop failures, population movements, and social unrest that strained the imperial administration's capacity to maintain order. The Gutian invasion that ultimately destroyed Akkadian power originated in the Zagros Mountains, where nomadic tribes had been gradually displaced by Akkadian expansion. These mountain peoples possessed military advantages, including superior knowledge of difficult terrain and mobility, that enabled them to avoid direct confrontation with Akkadian armies while striking at vulnerable targets throughout the empire. Gutian raiders systematically destroyed irrigation systems, captured major cities, and disrupted the trade networks that had supported Akkadian prosperity. Archaeological evidence from sites across Mesopotamia reveals the extent of destruction that accompanied the Gutian conquest. Destruction layers containing burned buildings, scattered human remains, and abandoned cuneiform archives mark the end of Akkadian occupation at numerous sites. The quality of material culture declined dramatically during this period, with crude pottery replacing the sophisticated ceramics of the Akkadian period and monumental construction projects being abandoned incomplete. The Gutian period of approximately 2154 to 2112 BCE represented one of the darkest chapters in Mesopotamian history, with traditional urban civilization giving way to fragmented political control and economic disruption. Gutian rulers, known primarily through the Sumerian king list and scattered contemporary inscriptions, appear to have lacked the administrative sophistication necessary to maintain the complex systems that supported Mesopotamian urban life. Their rule was characterized by arbitrary taxation, destruction of infrastructure, and neglect of the irrigation systems that were essential for agricultural productivity. The revival of Sumerian political power during the late Gutian period began in the southern city-states that had maintained some degree of autonomy under foreign rule. Lagash emerged as the most successful of these revival movements under the leadership of Gudea, who ruled as Ensi from approximately 2144 to 2124 BCE. Unlike the Gutian overlords, Gudea understood the cultural and religious foundations of Mesopotamian civilization, presenting himself as a traditional Sumerian ruler chosen by the gods to restore proper order and prosperity. Gudea's building programs demonstrated both the resources available to successful local rulers and the continuing vitality of Sumerian cultural traditions. His reconstruction of the Aninu temple dedicated to Ningirsu required the importation of exotic materials from across the known world, including cedarwood from Lebanon, gold from Anatolia, and diorite from Oman. The transportation of these materials during a period of political fragmentation required sophisticated diplomatic and commercial arrangements that testified to Gudea's administrative capabilities. The numerous statues of Gudea discovered at Lagash, carved from imported diorite and other precious stones, represent some of the finest sculptures produced in ancient Mesopotamia. These works demonstrate complete mastery of stone carving techniques, with smooth surfaces, precise proportions, and subtle modelling that creates remarkably lifelike representations. The inscriptions on these statues describe Gudea's pious activities and building projects in elaborate Sumerian poetry that shows the continuing literary sophistication of Sumerian culture despite the political chaos of the Gutian period. Other Sumerian cities experienced similar revivals during the late Gutian period, though none achieved the prominence of Gudea's Lagash. Urningirsu of Lagash, Gudea's son-in-law, continued his predecessor's policies of temple reconstruction and cultural renewal. At Uruk, local rulers reasserted control over the city's traditional territories and resumed the religious festivals that had been disrupted during the Gutian occupation. These local revivals laid the groundwork for the more comprehensive restoration of Sumerian power that would occur under the third dynasty of Ur. The second dynasty of Lagash, which included Gudea and his immediate successors, demonstrated that traditional Sumerian political and cultural forms retained their vitality despite the traumatic experience of foreign conquest and occupation. The careful preservation of religious traditions, architectural techniques, and literary compositions during this period ensured that subsequent rulers would have access to the accumulated wisdom of Sumerian civilization when conditions became favourable for more extensive political restoration. The expulsion of the Gutians from Mesopotamia marked the beginning of the most remarkable political restoration in ancient history. Utu-Hagel of Uruk, claiming descent from the legendary Gilgamesh, led the coalition of Sumerian cities that finally drove out the mountain invaders around 2120 BCE. His victory inscriptions, carved on clay tablets discovered at Uruk, describe systematic military campaigns that recaptured major urban centres and restored the irrigation networks that had been neglected during the century of foreign occupation. However, Utu-Hagel's triumph proved short-lived, as power quickly shifted to his military commander Ur-Nammu, who established the third dynasty of Ur and created the most centralized state that Mesopotamia had yet witnessed. Ur-Nammu's rise to power around 2112 BCE represented a fundamental transformation in Mesopotamian political organization. Unlike the traditional city-state rulers who had preceded him, Ur-Nammu constructed a unified administrative system that directly controlled territories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Zagros foothills. His royal inscriptions, written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, describe the systematic conquest of rival cities and the establishment of provincial administrations staffed by officials appointed directly from Ur. Archaeological excavations at sites throughout southern Mesopotamia have revealed standardized administrative buildings, uniform pottery styles, and identical architectural techniques that demonstrate the unprecedented degree of centralized control achieved by the Ur-3 state. The administrative revolution initiated by Ur-Nammu reached its full development under his son Shulgi, who ruled for 48 years from 2094 to 2047 BCE. Shulgi's bureaucratic innovations created the world's most sophisticated governmental system, with detailed records that provide extraordinary insight into ancient administrative practices. The Drehem Archive, discovered at a site 20 kilometers south of Nippur, contains over 40,000 cuneiform tablets documenting the operations of a massive livestock redistribution center that processed hundreds of thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats annually. These animals were collected as taxes from provinces throughout the empire, then redistributed to temples, royal workshops, and military units according to carefully calculated quotas. The scale of record-keeping under the Ur-3 administration exceeded anything previously attempted in human history. Scribes maintained detailed inventories of every aspect of state operations, from the number of workers employed in individual workshops to the precise quantities of raw materials consumed in craft production. The Girsu archive contains tablets recording the daily rations distributed to over 15,000 workers employed in textile production, including specific allocations for different categories of labourers based on their age, gender, and skill level. Women workers received barley rations ranging from 30 to 60 litres per month, depending on their productivity, while children received proportionally smaller amounts calculated according to standardized formulas. Provincial administration under the Ur-3 system divided the empire into approximately 20 major provinces, each governed by an Ensi who reported directly to the king at Ur. These provincial governors were responsible for tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial administration within their territories, but their authority was carefully circumscribed by royal officials who monitored their activities through regular inspections and detailed reporting requirements. The Pusrishdagan archive records the movements of provincial governors who were required to appear at court for annual festivals, bringing tribute payments and receiving new administrative instructions from the central government. The legal innovations of the Ur-3 period established precedents that would influence Mesopotamian jurisprudence for over a millennium. The Code of Ur-Nammu, preserved in copies dating to the Old Babylonian period but reflecting earlier legal traditions, represents humanity's earliest known systematic legal code. Unlike the later Code of Hammurabi, which emphasized retributive justice through the principle of talion, Ur-Nammu's laws prescribed monetary compensation for most offences. A person who caused another's death through negligence paid 60 shekels of silver to the victim's family, while theft of a sheep required payment of 10 sheep to the owner. These monetary penalties reflected the Ur-3 state's sophisticated understanding of economic relationships and its preference for restoring social harmony rather than inflicting physical punishment. The legal system's emphasis on written documentation created extensive archives of contracts, court decisions, and administrative rulings that illuminate daily life in unprecedented detail. Marriage contracts from the Ur III period specify the property rights of wives, the obligations of husbands, and the procedures for divorce with remarkable precision. A typical contract from Nippur records that Enlil-Bani, son of Lunana, married Nin-Shatapada, daughter of Ur-Enlila, with a bride price of 20 shekels of silver and a dowry including household furnishings, jewellery, and agricultural tools valued at 15 shekels. The contract specifies that if Enlil-Bani divorced his wife without cause, he would forfeit his bride price and pay additional compensation, while if Nin-Shatapada abandoned her husband, she would lose her dowry rights. Property transactions during this period required elaborate documentation that protected the interests of all parties while ensuring state control over land transfers. Real estate sales involved multiple witnesses, official seals, and registration with provincial authorities who maintained comprehensive records of land ownership. A field sale contract from Girsu records the purchase of 18 hectares of irrigated farmland by Urlisi, son of Lugal-Ezem, for 180 shekels of silver, with the transaction witnessed by 7 officials including the local ensi, and recorded in the provincial land registry. The contract includes detailed descriptions of field boundaries, water rights, and tax obligations that would transfer with the property. Economic organization under the Ur III state represented the most sophisticated redistribution system ever created in the ancient world. The central government collected taxes in the form of agricultural products, craft goods, and labor service, then redistributed these resources according to complex formulas that supported the military, bureaucracy, religious institutions, and royal court. The Kanesh archive contains tablets recording the shipment of over 3,000 tons of wool annually from Mesopotamian provinces to Anatolian trading posts, demonstrating the vast scale of economic activity coordinated by the Ur III administration. Textile production became the empire's most important industry, with specialized workshops employing thousands of workers in the manufacture of woolen cloth for both domestic use and export trade. The Girsu Textile Archive documents workshops that employed over 6,000 women and children in various stages of cloth production, from sheep shearing and wool cleaning to spinning, weaving, and finishing. These workshops operated according to strict production quotas, with individual workers expected to process specific quantities of raw materials daily. A skilled weaver was required to produce 4 meters of standard cloth per day, while spinners had to produce 0.5 kilograms of thread from raw wool. The quality control systems implemented in Ur III workshops exceeded anything previously attempted in ancient manufacturing. Supervisors inspected finished products according to standardized criteria, rejecting items that failed to meet specifications and penalizing workers whose production fell below acceptable standards. The most skilled craftsmen received higher rations and better working conditions, while those who consistently produced inferior work faced reduced food allocations or reassignment to less desirable tasks. This merit-based system encouraged innovation and quality improvement while maintaining the high production standards necessary for successful export trade. Agricultural management under the Ur III system achieved unprecedented efficiency through systematic planning and resource allocation. State officials maintained detailed records of field productivity, irrigation requirements, and labor needs that enabled optimal crop rotation and land use patterns. The Girsu Agricultural Archive contains tablets recording the cultivation of over 25,000 hectares of state-controlled farmland, with specific notations for different crop types, planting schedules, and expected yields. barley fields typically produced 1,800 litres per hectare, while date palm groves yielded approximately 900 kilograms of dates annually per mature tree. Irrigation system maintenance received constant attention from Ur-3 administrators, who understood that agricultural productivity depended entirely on reliable water supplies. Teams of specialized workers were assigned to canal cleaning, levee repair, and drainage system maintenance, according to carefully planned schedules that coordinated with agricultural cycles. The Umma archive records the employment of over 2,000 workers annually in irrigation maintenance, with specific assignments for different types of hydraulic work. Canal dredging required teams of 50, 100 men working for several weeks to remove accumulated silt, while levee construction employed smaller groups of skilled workers who understood the engineering principles necessary for effective flood control. Architectural achievements during the Ur-3 period demonstrated both the resources available to the centralized state and the sophisticated engineering knowledge that had accumulated over centuries of monumental construction. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu and completed by Shulgi, represented the pinnacle of Mesopotamian architectural achievement. The massive structure measured 64 by 46 meters at its base and rose to a height of approximately 30 meters through 3 distinct stages, each smaller than the one below. The ziggurat's core consisted of mud brick construction using over 720,000 individual bricks, while the exterior was faced with fired brick set in bitumen mortar that provided waterproof protection against the region's occasional heavy rains. The ziggurat's construction required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles that prevented collapse under the enormous weight of the upper levels. Internal buttresses distributed loads evenly throughout the structure, while carefully planned drainage systems prevented water accumulation that could undermine the foundation. The builders incorporated expansion joints that allowed for thermal movement without cracking, and the entire structure was designed to settle uniformly as the underlying soil compressed under the building's weight. These engineering solutions represented accumulated knowledge from centuries of monumental construction and demonstrated the technical capabilities that made such ambitious projects possible. Urban planning during the Ur-3 period reflected systematic approaches to city organization that balance residential, commercial, and religious functions. Excavations at Ur have revealed carefully planned neighborhoods with standardized house designs, regular street patterns, and centralized facilities for water supply and waste disposal. Residential areas were organized according to social status, with larger houses for wealthy families located near temple complexes and smaller dwellings for workers and craftsmen situated closer to industrial areas. The city's commercial district included specialized markets for different types of goods, with separate areas for textile sales, metalwork, pottery, and food products. The harbour facilities at Ur demonstrated sophisticated understanding of maritime engineering and commercial requirements. The artificial harbour, connected to the Euphrates River by a canal system, could accommodate dozens of large merchant vessels simultaneously. Stone quays provided secure moorings for ships, while adjacent warehouses offered protected storage for imported goods. The harbour's administrative building housed customs officials who inspected incoming cargoes, collected import duties, and maintained records of all commercial transactions. These facilities enabled Ur to serve as the primary port for trade with the Persian Gulf region and beyond. Religious architecture during the Ur-3 period combined traditional Sumerian forms with innovations that reflected the dynasty's political ambitions. The Ekishnugal temple complex at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, covered over 4 hectares and included multiple shrines, administrative offices, workshops, and residential quarters for the priesthood. The main temple building featured a central sanctuary measuring 20 by 40 meters, with walls decorated with elaborate geometric patterns created using colored clay cones pressed into the mud brick surface. The temple's interior included a raised platform for the god's statue, surrounded by offering tables where priests presented daily meals of bread, beer, meat, and fruits. The integration of royal and religious architecture reflected the Ur-3 kings' claims to divine authority and their role as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. The royal palace at Ur, though poorly preserved due to later construction, appears to have been connected to the temple complex through covered passages that allowed the king to participate in religious ceremonies without appearing in public. Royal apartments included private shrines where the king could perform personal devotions, while public reception halls provided appropriate settings for audiences with foreign ambassadors and provincial officials. Military organization under the Ur-3 system combined professional standing forces with provincial militias that could be mobilized for major campaigns. The core army consisted of approximately 5,000 professional soldiers stationed at Ur and other major centers, equipped with standardized bronze weapons and trained in coordinated tactics. These professionals served as officers and specialists for larger forces recruited from the general population during times of war. Military records from the Drehem archive indicate that provincial governors were required to maintain quotas of trained soldiers and provide specific quantities of military equipment including spears, shields, and arrows. The Ur-3 military's logistical capabilities enabled sustained operations across the empire's extensive territories. Supply depots located at strategic points throughout the provinces maintained stockpiles of weapons, food, and other military necessities that could support army operations without requiring lengthy supply trains from the capital. Military roads constructed during this period provided rapid communication between different regions and enabled the quick movement of troops to threatened areas. These roads included bridges across major rivers, way stations for rest and resupply, and fortified posts that controlled access to strategic locations. Naval forces played an increasingly important role in Ur-3 military operations as the empire's trade networks expanded into the Persian Gulf and beyond. The royal fleet included both military vessels designed for coastal patrol and troop transport, and specialized ships for long-distance trade expeditions. Archaeological evidence from Failaka Island in Kuwait Bay indicates that Ur-3 forces established permanent bases in the Gulf region to protect merchant shipping and collect tribute from local populations. These naval operations required sophisticated knowledge of navigation, ship construction, and maritime logistics that represented significant advances over earlier Mesopotamian naval capabilities. The diplomatic practices developed during the Ur-3 period established precedents for international relations that would influence Near Eastern politics for centuries. Royal correspondence preserved in archives at Mari and other sites reveals sophisticated protocols for communication between rulers, including standardized formulas for different types of diplomatic messages and elaborate gift exchanges that reinforced political relationships. Marriage alliances between the Ur-3 royal family and foreign dynasties created kinship networks that facilitated peaceful resolution of territorial disputes and trade disagreements. The tribute system implemented by Ur-3 rulers created a network of dependent states that provided resources and military support in exchange for protection and commercial privileges. Tributary relationships were formalized through written agreements that specified annual payment obligations, military service requirements, and the procedures for resolving disputes. The Kanesh archive contains copies of tribute agreements with Anatolian city-states that required annual payments of silver, copper, and textiles in exchange for trading rights and protection from nomadic raiders. The sophisticated administrative machinery that had sustained the third dynasty of Ur for over a century began showing signs of strain during the final years of Ibbi-Sin's reign. Provincial archives from Girsu and Puzrish Dagan reveal increasingly desperate attempts to maintain tax collection as agricultural productivity declined and regional governors asserted greater autonomy. Cuneiform tablets dating to 2010 to 2005 BCE record shortfalls in grain deliveries, delays in tribute payments, and the abandonment of several major irrigation projects that had previously been maintained through centralized labor coordination. The Drehem Livestock Redistribution Center, which had processed hundreds of thousands of animals annually during Shulgi's reign, handled fewer than 50,000 head of cattle and sheep in its final operational year, indicating the collapse of the economic networks that had supported Ur-3 power. External pressures mounted simultaneously as Elamite forces from the Iranian highlands began systematic raids against Mesopotamian settlements east of the Tigris River. Unlike the opportunistic Gutian invasions that had destroyed the Akkadian Empire, the Elamite campaigns represented coordinated military operations launched from the established kingdom of Anshan and Susa. Elamite armies employed bronze weapons and siege techniques learned through contact with Mesopotamian civilization, but they retained the mobility and knowledge of difficult terrain that gave mountain peoples decisive advantages over the infantry formations preferred by lowland armies. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Diyala River shows destruction layers dating to approximately 2010 BCE, with burned buildings and scattered human remains indicating systematic attacks against fortified settlements. The Elamite conquest of Susa around 2008 BCE eliminated Ur's most important eastern stronghold and severed the trade routes that had connected Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau. Susa had served as a crucial administrative centre where Ur-3 officials collected tribute from highland populations and managed the complex logistics required for long-distance trade in metals, precious stones and exotic materials. The city's capture provided Elamite forces with detailed intelligence about Mesopotamian military capabilities and administrative procedures, while its substantial treasury funded further military operations against remaining Ur-3 territories. Internal rebellions erupted throughout the empire as provincial governors recognized the central government's inability to provide effective military protection. Ishbi-Era, governor of Izin, declared independence around 2017 BCE and began expanding his territory at Ur's expense. His forces captured several cities in northern Babylonia, including Nippur, whose religious significance made its loss particularly damaging to Ur-3 legitimacy. Contemporary letters between Ibbi-Sin and his remaining loyal governors reveal the king's growing desperation as he attempted to coordinate resistance against multiple enemies with increasingly limited resources. The siege of Ur itself began around 2006 BCE, when combined Elamite and Amorite forces surrounded the city and systematically destroyed its agricultural hinterland. Unlike earlier sieges that had relied primarily on starvation tactics, the attackers employed sophisticated engineering techniques, including the construction of siege mounds that enabled direct assaults against the city's walls. Archaeological excavations in Ur's residential districts have uncovered evidence of the siege's final phases, including arrowheads embedded in building walls, hastily constructed barricades blocking street access, and household hoards of valuables buried by residents who never returned to retrieve them. The capture of Ibbi-Sin in 2004 BCE marked the definitive end of independent Sumerian political power. Elamite inscriptions from Susa describe the fallen king's humiliating treatment as a prisoner, forced to serve in menial capacities at the Elamite court while his former kingdom was systematically plundered. The royal palace at Ur was stripped of its precious furnishings, religious statues were carried away as war trophies, and the administrative archives that had documented 2 centuries of bureaucratic innovation were scattered or destroyed. The Great Ziggurat survived the conquest, but was abandoned as Elamite forces lacked the administrative infrastructure necessary to maintain such massive architectural projects. The collapse of centralized authority created a power vacuum that was gradually filled by Amorite chieftains who had been infiltrating Mesopotamia for several generations. These Semitic-speaking nomads from the Syrian desert possessed military advantages including superior mobility and familiarity with cavalry tactics, but they initially lacked the administrative knowledge necessary to govern complex urban societies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sippar and Babylon shows a marked decline in material culture during the early 20th century BCE, with crude pottery replacing the sophisticated ceramics of the Ur-III period and monumental construction projects being abandoned incomplete. The establishment of Babylonian control over former Sumerian territories occurred gradually through a series of military campaigns and diplomatic arrangements spanning nearly 2 centuries. Hammurabi of Babylon, who ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE, represents the most successful of the Amorite rulers who learned to combine traditional Mesopotamian administrative practices with their own military innovations. His conquest of Larsa in 1763 BCE brought the last independent Sumerian city under Babylonian control, completing the political transformation that had begun with the fall of Uruk. Hammurabi's legal code, carved on a black diorite stele discovered at Susa where it had been taken as war booty by Elamite raiders, demonstrates the sophisticated synthesis of Sumerian and Amorite legal traditions that characterized early Babylonian administration. The code's 282 laws drew heavily on earlier Sumerian legal precedents, particularly the Code of Ur-Nammu, but adapted these traditions to reflect Amorite social structures and values. Property laws continued to recognize the complex irrigation rights that were essential for Mesopotamian agriculture, while family law incorporated Amorite customs regarding marriage, divorce, and inheritance that differed significantly from earlier Sumerian practices. The Code of Hammurabi's prologue explicitly acknowledges the ruler's debt to Sumerian civilization, describing how the gods Anu and Enlil had chosen him to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, and to ensure that the strong should not harm the weak. This language directly echoed Sumerian royal inscriptions dating back to the early dynastic period, indicating conscious efforts to present Babylonian rule as the legitimate continuation of ancient Mesopotamian traditions rather than foreign conquest. Babylonian administrative practices incorporated many features of the Ur-III system, while adapting them to the realities of governing a multi-ethnic population. Provincial administration continued to rely on appointed governors who reported to the central government, but these officials were often drawn from local elite families rather than being sent from the capital. This practice helped maintain continuity with traditional power structures while ensuring loyalty to the Babylonian crown. Cuneiform tablets from old Babylonian archives show that tax collection, judicial administration, and military recruitment followed procedures that were recognizably descended from Ur-III practices. The preservation of Sumerian religious traditions under Babylonian rule reflected both political necessity and genuine cultural appreciation. Babylonian kings understood that their authority over Mesopotamian populations depended on maintaining proper relationships with the traditional gods who were believed to control agricultural fertility, military success, and social order. Rather than imposing their own religious practices, Amorite rulers adopted Sumerian theological concepts while gradually elevating their own patron deities to positions of prominence within the established pantheon. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, exemplifies this religious synthesis. Originally a minor deity associated with agriculture and healing, Marduk was gradually elevated to supreme authority over the Mesopotamian pantheon through theological innovations that presented him as the champion of cosmic order against the forces of chaos. The Enuma Elish, a Creation epic composed during the Old Babylonian period, describes Marduk's victory over the primordial sea goddess Tiamat and his subsequent organization of the universe according to divine law. This myth provided ideological justification for Babylonian political supremacy while incorporating traditional Sumerian cosmological concepts. Temple administration under Babylonian rule maintained the economic functions that had made religious institutions central to Mesopotamian civilization for over a millennium. Major temples continued to control vast agricultural estates, operate craft workshops, and manage long-distance trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with distant regions. The Sippar archive, containing over 40,000 cuneiform tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period, documents the operations of the Shamash temple, which employed thousands of workers in various capacities and controlled agricultural lands covering hundreds of square kilometers. The integration of Sumerian and Babylonian religious practices created new forms of worship that combined traditional rituals with innovations reflecting changed political circumstances. Festival calendars from Old Babylonian temples show the continuation of ancient Sumerian celebrations, like the Akitu New Year festival, but with modified ceremonies that acknowledged Babylonian royal authority. The king's role in these festivals evolved from the traditional Sumerian concept of divine selection to incorporate Amorite ideas about hereditary kingship and personal charisma. Educational systems during the Old Babylonian period preserved Sumerian literary and scholarly traditions while adapting them for use in a multilingual society. Scribal schools continued to teach cuneiform writing using traditional Sumerian texts, but students also learned to write Akkadian and other languages needed for administrative and commercial purposes. The curriculum included classical Sumerian literary works like the Epic of Gilgamesh, mathematical texts that preserved sophisticated computational techniques, and legal formulations that had been developed over centuries of judicial practice. The famous school texts from Nippur provide detailed insight into Old Babylonian educational practices and their relationship to Sumerian cultural transmission. Students began their education by copying lists of cuneiform signs and their various meanings, progressing through increasingly complex exercises that included mathematical problems, legal formulas, and literary compositions. Advanced students studied classical Sumerian poetry, learning to appreciate the sophisticated wordplay, alliteration, and parallel structures that characterize the finest examples of Mesopotamian literature. Mathematical education during this period built upon computational techniques that had been developed during the Ur-3 period to support complex administrative calculations. Babylonian mathematicians made significant advances in algebra and geometry, developing methods for solving quadratic equations and calculating areas and volumes that would not be surpassed until the Greek period. These mathematical innovations were preserved in cuneiform tablets that served as textbooks for scribal students and reference works for practicing administrators. Legal education emphasized the practical application of written law codes and judicial precedents to resolve disputes and maintain social order. Students learned to draft contracts, record court proceedings, and apply legal principles to complex cases involving property rights, commercial transactions, and family relationships. The preservation of extensive legal archives from Old Babylonian cities demonstrates the sophisticated jurisprudential traditions that had evolved from earlier Sumerian legal practices. the gradual decline of spoken Sumerian as a living language represents one of the most significant cultural transformations of this period. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Sumerian ceased to be used for daily communication in most areas by approximately 1800 BCE, though it continued to be employed for religious, legal and scholarly purposes for nearly 2 millennia longer. This linguistic shift occurred gradually as Akkadian-speaking populations became numerically dominant and Sumerian speakers were absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian population. The preservation of Sumerian as a liturgical and scholarly language required systematic efforts by educational institutions and religious establishments. Temple schools maintained curricula that included intensive Sumerian language instruction, ensuring that priests and scribes could continue to read and compose texts in the ancient language. Bilingual dictionaries and grammatical texts were compiled to help Akkadian speakers learn Sumerian vocabulary and grammar, creating resources that modern scholars still use to understand the language. Religious institutions played a crucial role in maintaining Sumerian linguistic traditions through their continued use of ancient hymns, prayers, and ritual texts. Many of these compositions were believed to be particularly efficacious when recited in their original Sumerian form, creating strong incentives for priests to maintain accurate pronunciation and understanding of the language. Temple libraries preserved extensive collections of Sumerian religious literature, often with interlinear Akkadian translations that helped ensure accurate interpretation. The compilation of lexical texts during the Old Babylonian period represents a remarkable scholarly achievement that preserved detailed knowledge of Sumerian vocabulary, grammar, and literary conventions. These reference works, organized thematically and alphabetically, provided comprehensive guides to Sumerian linguistic usage that enabled scribes to compose new texts in the ancient language centuries after it had ceased to be spoken. The most extensive of these compilations contained over 10,000 Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents, along with detailed grammatical explanations and usage examples. Literary composition in Sumerian continued throughout the Old Babylonian period, though the language was now learned as a classical tongue rather than acquired naturally through childhood exposure. Scribes composed new hymns, prayers, and narrative poems in Sumerian, often displaying remarkable mastery of traditional poetic techniques and vocabulary. These compositions demonstrate that Sumerian literary traditions remained vital and creative even after the language's transformation from vernacular speech to scholarly medium. The influence of Sumerian cultural traditions extended far beyond language preservation to encompass artistic, architectural, and technological practices that continue to shape Mesopotamian civilization. Babylonian craftsmen maintained the sophisticated metalworking, textile production, and ceramic techniques that had been developed during earlier periods, often improving upon traditional methods while preserving their essential characteristics. Archaeological evidence from old Babylonian workshops shows the continued production of cylinder seals, bronze sculptures, and decorated pottery that followed artistic conventions established during the Sumerian period. Architectural traditions similarly demonstrated continuity with earlier practices while adapting to changed political and social circumstances. Babylonian builders continued to construct ziggurats, though these structures were often smaller and less elaborate than their earthly predecessors. The basic architectural principles of buttressed walls, elevated platforms, and tripartite building plans remained standard features of Mesopotamian monumental construction, creating visual and functional continuities that linked old Babylonian buildings with their ancient Sumerian antecedents. The adaptation of Sumerian agricultural and irrigation techniques by Babylonian administrators ensured the continued productivity of Mesopotamian farmland despite political disruptions. Canal maintenance, crop rotation systems, and field management practices that had been developed over centuries of intensive cultivation were preserved and refined by new rulers who recognized their essential importance for maintaining urban populations. Technical manuals written during the Old Babylonian period codified traditional agricultural knowledge while incorporating innovations that improved yields and reduced labor requirements. Commercial practices during this period similarly combined Sumerian traditions with innovations that reflected the expanded geographical scope of Babylonian trade networks. Merchant families that had operated during the Ur-3 period continued their activities under Babylonian rule, often expanding their operations to include new markets in Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. The famous Kanesh trade archives document the activities of Assyrian merchants who maintained permanent trading posts throughout Anatolia, conducting business according to legal and commercial practices that were ultimately derived from Sumerian precedents. The synthesis of Sumerian and Amorite cultural traditions created a distinctive Babylonian civilization that preserved the essential achievements of earlier Mesopotamian development while adapting them to new political and social realities. This cultural fusion enabled the continued flourishing of urban civilization in Mesopotamia, despite the traumatic political disruptions that had ended native Sumerian independence. The preservation of Sumerian religious, legal, and scholarly traditions within Babylonian institutional frameworks ensured that the accumulated wisdom of the world's first civilization would continue to influence human development for centuries to come. The technological innovations that emerged from Sumerian workshops and agricultural fields between 3500 and 2000 BCE fundamentally transformed human civilization in ways that extended far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. These practical solutions to everyday challenges spread throughout the ancient world through trade networks, military conquest, and cultural exchange, establishing technological foundations that would support urban civilization for millennia. The potter's wheel, developed around 3500 BCE in Sumerian workshops, revolutionized ceramic production by enabling craftsmen to create perfectly symmetrical vessels with thin walls and smooth surfaces that were impossible to achieve through hand-building techniques. Archaeological evidence from Uruk shows the rapid adoption of wheel-thrown pottery, with production increasing dramatically as individual potters could manufacture dozens of standardized vessels daily, rather than the handful possible through traditional coil and pinch methods. The wheel's impact extended beyond pottery production as Sumerian engineers adapted the rotating principle for other applications. By 3200 BCE, wheeled vehicles appeared in Mesopotamian cities, initially as solid-wheeled carts pulled by oxen for transporting heavy materials during construction projects. These early wheels were constructed from 3 wooden planks held together with copper brackets and leather bindings, creating sturdy but heavy assemblies that could support substantial loads across the flat terrain of the alluvial plain. The technology spread rapidly along trade routes, reaching the Indus Valley by 2800 BCE and appearing in European archaeological contexts by 2500 BCE, fundamentally altering transportation capabilities across the ancient world. Sumerian innovations in water transportation proved equally transformative for long-distance trade and cultural exchange. The development of efficient sailboats around 3500 BCE enabled merchants to navigate the complex waterways of southern Mesopotamia, while carrying much larger cargoes than were possible with paddle-powered vessels. Early Sumerian boats featured square-rigged sails woven from flax or wool, supported by bipod masts that could be easily lowered when navigating under bridges or through shallow channels. The hulls were constructed using a sophisticated combination of wooden planking sealed with bitumen, creating waterproof vessels capable of carrying several tons of cargo across hundreds of kilometers of rivers and canals. The refinement of boat-building techniques enabled Sumerian merchants to establish regular trading connections throughout the Persian Gulf and beyond. Archaeological evidence from Dilmun shows extensive Sumerian commercial activity by 2800 BCE, with permanent trading posts that handled the exchange of Mesopotamian textiles and metalwork for copper from Oman, pearls from the Gulf waters, and exotic materials from the Indus Valley. These maritime networks facilitated not only commercial exchange, but also the transmission of technological knowledge, artistic styles, and cultural practices across vast distances. Agricultural innovations developed in Sumerian fields transformed farming practices throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The ox-drawn plough, perfected around 3000 BCE, enabled farmers to cultivate heavy clay soils that had previously been too difficult to work with simple digging sticks or hand tools. Sumerian ploughs featured bronze-tipped shares that could cut through compacted earth, while their wooden moldboards turned the soil to bury weeds and crop residues. The efficiency gains are remarkable. A farmer with an ox-drawn plough could prepare 10 times more land for planting than was possible through manual cultivation, supporting larger populations and enabling the specialization of labor that characterized urban civilization. The sophisticated irrigation systems developed in Mesopotamia established engineering principles that influenced hydraulic projects throughout the ancient world. Sumerian engineers learned to calculate water flow rates, design efficient channel gradients, and construct control structures that could regulate water distribution across vast agricultural areas. The shaduf, a counterweighted lifting device that enabled farmers to raise water from canals to higher field levels, spread from Mesopotamia to Egypt and the Indus Valley, becoming a standard feature of irrigation agriculture. More complex innovations included the Qanat system of underground channels that transported water across long distances without significant evaporation losses, a technology that was later adopted throughout the Iranian Plateau and Central Asia. The development of standardized measurement systems in Sumerian administrative centers created the foundation for accurate engineering calculations and fair commercial transactions. The Sumerian system, based on multiples of 60 established units for length, area, volume and weight that could be precisely reproduced using physical standards maintained in temple complexes. A standard Sumerian cubit measured approximately 49.5 centimeters, divided into 30 fingers of 1.65 centimeters each, enabling craftsmen and engineers to work with consistent measurements across different projects and locations. These metrological innovations spread throughout Mesopotamia and were adapted by neighboring civilizations, creating the mathematical foundations necessary for complex architectural and engineering projects. The literary achievements of Sumerian civilization established narrative and poetic traditions that profoundly influenced subsequent cultures throughout the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier oral traditions, created the template for heroic literature that would be followed by countless later works. The epic's exploration of themes including friendship, mortality, the abuse of power, and the relationship between civilization and nature established literary conventions that appear in Greek, Roman, and biblical literature. The story's central narrative structure, following a hero's journey through trials that ultimately lead to wisdom and self-understanding, became a fundamental pattern in world literature. The sophisticated poetic techniques employed in Sumerian literature demonstrate remarkable artistic achievement that influenced literary development across multiple cultures. Sumerian poets mastered complex forms of parallelism, where successive lines repeated and varied central themes through subtle changes in vocabulary and imagery. The Lament for the Destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BCE, employs intricate patterns of repetition and variation that create powerful emotional effects while preserving historical memory of political catastrophe. These poetic techniques appear in Hebrew biblical literature, particularly in the Psalms and prophetic books, suggesting direct cultural transmission from Mesopotamian to Israelite literary traditions. Creation myths composed in Sumerian established cosmological frameworks that influenced religious thinking throughout the ancient Near East. The Eridu Genesis, describing the creation of humanity and the Great Flood, provided narrative elements that appear in later Akkadian, Hebrew, and Greek mythological traditions. The Sumerian account describes the gods' decision to create humans as workers who would maintain the earth and serve divine needs, a concept that appears in modified form in the biblical book of Genesis. The flood narrative, featuring a righteous man who saves humanity and animals by building a large boat, clearly influenced the biblical story of Noah and similar flood myths found in numerous ancient cultures. Sumerian wisdom literature established literary forms and philosophical themes that shaped intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The instructions of Ptahhotep and similar Egyptian wisdom texts show clear influence from Sumerian models, while Hebrew wisdom literature, including Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, employs literary structures and thematic concerns that can be traced to Mesopotamian precedents. Sumerian compositions explored fundamental questions about justice, suffering, proper behavior, and the relationship between human actions and divine will, establishing philosophical frameworks that would be developed by later thinkers. The preservation and transmission of Sumerian literary works occurred through educational systems that maintained these texts as essential components of scribal training for over 2 millennia after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. Babylonian and Assyrian schools continued to copy and study classical Sumerian literature, creating extensive libraries that preserved hundreds of compositions. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled in the 7th century BCE, contained thousands of tablets with Sumerian literary works, often accompanied by Akkadian translations and scholarly commentaries that demonstrate continued engagement with ancient Mesopotamian culture. Religious and mythological concepts developed in Sumerian temples influenced theological development throughout the ancient world in ways that extended far beyond direct cultural contact. The Sumerian pantheon's organization, with specialized deities controlling different aspects of natural and human activity, provided a model for polytheistic systems that appeared in numerous ancient cultures. Inanna's role as goddess of love and war influenced the development of similar deities, including Ishtar in Babylon, Astarte in the Levant, and Aphrodite in Greece, demonstrating the spread of specific divine archetypes across cultural boundaries. The concept of divine kingship developed in Sumerian city-states where rulers claimed divine selection and support, influenced political theology throughout the ancient Near East. Egyptian pharaohs adopted similar concepts of divine authority, while Mesopotamian ideas about royal responsibility for maintaining cosmic order appear in Persian, Greek, and Roman political thought. The Sumerian king's role as intermediary between human and divine realms established precedents for sacred kingship that influenced political organization across multiple civilizations. Sumerian religious practices, particularly the elaborate temple rituals that maintained relationships between communities and their patron deities, established ceremonial patterns that influenced worship practices throughout the region. The daily care of divine statues, including feeding, clothing, and entertaining the gods, created ritual frameworks that were adopted by neighboring cultures and transmitted across generations. Temple architecture developed in Mesopotamia, featuring elevated platforms, tripartite ground plans, and elaborate decorative programs, influenced religious building throughout the ancient world. The development of systematic theology in Sumerian religious centers created intellectual frameworks for understanding divine nature and cosmic organization that influenced religious thinking far beyond Mesopotamia. Sumerian theologians developed concepts of divine hierarchy, cosmic order, and moral responsibility that appear in modified forms in later religious traditions. The idea that human suffering could result from divine displeasure, requiring ritual purification and proper worship to restore divine favor, became central to religious thinking throughout the ancient Near East. Educational and scholarly traditions established in Sumerian temple and palace schools created institutional models for preserving and transmitting knowledge that influenced intellectual development across multiple civilizations. The Aduba system, with its structured curriculum progressing from basic literacy through advanced literary and mathematical studies, established educational patterns that were adopted throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The preservation of extensive libraries containing thousands of cuneiform tablets created precedents for systematic knowledge collection that influenced later library development in Alexandria, Pergamon, and other centers of learning. The development of lexicography in Sumerian schools, producing comprehensive dictionaries and reference works that preserved linguistic knowledge across centuries, established scholarly methods that influenced linguistic studies throughout the ancient world. Sumerian lexical texts organized vocabulary thematically and provided detailed grammatical information that enabled scribes to continue composing in the ancient language long after it ceased to be spoken. These scholarly techniques influenced the development of similar reference works in other languages and cultures. Mathematical education in Sumerian schools established computational techniques and problem-solving methods that influenced mathematical development throughout the ancient world. Sumerian mathematicians developed sophisticated methods for calculating areas, volumes, and proportions that were essential for architectural and engineering projects. The sexagesimal number system, based on multiples of 60, provided computational advantages for complex calculations and was adopted throughout Mesopotamia, influencing mathematical development in astronomy, engineering, and commerce. The preservation of historical records in Sumerian archives established precedents for systematic historical documentation that influenced historical writing throughout the ancient world. The Sumerian king list and similar chronological compilations created frameworks for organizing historical information that were adopted by later historians. The practice of recording contemporary events in official inscriptions and administrative documents created historical sources that enabled later scholars to reconstruct ancient political and social developments. Scientific observations recorded in Sumerian texts, particularly astronomical data collected for calendar making and agricultural planning, established systematic approaches to natural phenomena that influenced scientific development throughout the ancient world. Sumerian astronomers identified celestial patterns and developed mathematical models for predicting astronomical events that were refined by later Babylonian and Greek scientists. Medical texts preserved in Sumerian archives documented treatments and diagnostic procedures that influenced medical practice throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The technological innovations, literary achievements, religious concepts, and educational traditions developed in Sumerian civilization created cultural foundations that supported human development for millennia after the political independence of Sumerian city-states had ended. The preservation of Sumerian knowledge through institutional continuity and cultural transmission ensured that these achievements would continue to influence human civilization long after the original creators had been absorbed into larger political entities. The synthesis of practical innovation with sophisticated cultural expression that characterized Sumerian civilization established patterns of urban development that would be repeated throughout human history, creating lasting contributions to the human experience that continue to influence modern life in ways both obvious and subtle. The rediscovery of Sumerian civilization began in the mid-19th century when European explorers and diplomats, initially seeking biblical antiquities and artistic treasures, stumbled upon the remains of humanity's first urban centers, buried beneath the tells of southern Iraq. Paul-Émile Botta, French consul in Mosul from 1842 to 1845, conducted the first systematic excavations at Khorsabad, initially believing he had uncovered the biblical Nineveh. Though his site proved to be Sargon II's Assyrian capital of Dur-Sharukin, Botta's meticulous documentation of massive stone reliefs, cuneiform inscriptions, and architectural remains demonstrated that ancient Mesopotamia contained civilizations of unprecedented sophistication. His detailed drawings and plaster casts shipped to the Louvre provided European scholars with their first concrete evidence of the advanced urban cultures that had flourished in the region millennia before classical antiquity. Austin Henry Layard's excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh between 1845 and 1851 captured public imagination through spectacular discoveries that filled the British Museum with colossal winged bulls, elaborate palace reliefs, and thousands of cuneiform tablets. Layard's popular accounts of his adventures, complete with dramatic descriptions of uncovering buried palaces and deciphering ancient scripts, transformed archaeology from an academic pursuit into a source of public fascination. His worker's discovery of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh in 1850 yielded over 30,000 cuneiform tablets that would prove crucial for understanding Mesopotamian literature, including the first complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh to reach European scholars. The gradual recognition that these Assyrian and Babylonian sites represented only the latest phases of Mesopotamian civilization came through careful analysis of architectural stratigraphy and artifact typology. Excavators noticed that deeper levels contained pottery styles, building techniques, and artistic motifs that differed significantly from the well-documented Neo-Assyrian remains. French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzec's work at Tello beginning in 1877 revealed sculpture and inscriptions in a previously unknown style, featuring rulers with names like Gudea and Urningirsu, who claimed titles and described achievements that predated known Babylonian and Assyrian kings by over a millennium. The decipherment of cuneiform script represented one of the 19th century's greatest intellectual achievements, requiring decades of collaborative effort by scholars across Europe. Georg Friedrich Grotefend made the crucial breakthrough in 1802 by correctly identifying royal names in Old Persian cuneiform inscriptions from Persepolis, using his knowledge of classical sources that mentioned Achaemenid kings. His recognition that certain sign groups represented the names Darius and Xerxes, combined with genealogical information from Greek historians, enabled him to assign phonetic values to individual cuneiform signs and establish the basic principles of the writing system. Sir Henry Rawlinson expanded upon Grotefend's foundation through his dangerous copying of the trilingual Behistun inscription on a cliff face in western Iran. Working from 1835 to 1847, often suspended by ropes hundreds of feet above the ground, Rawlinson painstakingly recorded the Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian versions of Darius I's account of his rise to power. His complete transcription provided scholars with an extensive bilingual text that, enabled systematic comparison between known Old Persian words and their Babylonian equivalents, dramatically expanding the vocabulary of deciphered cuneiform signs. Jules Opper's contributions to cuneiform decipherment proved equally crucial, particularly his recognition that the script had been adapted to write multiple languages with fundamentally different grammatical structures. His 1859 publication Éléments de la grammaire assyrienne established systematic methods for analysing Akkadian grammar and demonstrated that many tablets contained texts in a non-Semitic language that he correctly identified as Sumerian. Oppert's linguistic analysis revealed that Sumerian was neither Indo-European nor Semitic, representing instead a completely distinct language family that had been preserved through cuneiform writing long after it ceased to be spoken. The collaborative nature of cuneiform decipherment became evident in 1857 when the Royal Asiatic Society conducted a famous test of the new science. 4 leading scholars, Rawlinson, Oppert, Edward Hincks, and William Henry Fox Talbot, were each given sealed copies of a recently discovered Akkadian text and asked to provide independent translations. Their remarkably similar results, published together, demonstrated that cuneiform decipherment had achieved sufficient accuracy to produce reliable translations of ancient Mesopotamian texts, establishing the field on a solid scholarly foundation. The recognition of Sumerian as a distinct language and culture emerged gradually as scholars analysed increasingly ancient texts and archaeological remains. Early excavators had assumed that all cuneiform inscriptions were written in Akkadian or other known Semitic languages, but careful analysis revealed grammatical structures and vocabulary that could not be explained through Semitic linguistics. The breakthrough came when scholars realized that many Akkadian texts contained interlinear translations of earlier Sumerian compositions, providing direct evidence of the relationship between the two languages and cultures. Archaeological excavations at Sumerian sites accelerated dramatically in the early 20th century, as improved techniques enabled more systematic investigation of ancient settlements. The University of Pennsylvania's expeditions to Nippur between 1888 and 1900, led by John Punnett Peters and Hermann Hilprecht, established rigorous standards for stratigraphic excavation and artifact recording that reveal the site's continuous occupation from the 4th millennium BCE through the Islamic period. Their discovery of the temple library containing thousands of Sumerian literary and administrative texts provided unprecedented insight into ancient Mesopotamian intellectual life. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur between 1922 and 1934 captured worldwide attention through spectacular discoveries that transformed public understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The royal cemetery's elaborate burials, complete with golden artifacts and evidence of human sacrifice, demonstrated levels of wealth and artistic sophistication that rivaled anything known from ancient Egypt or Greece. Woolley's meticulous documentation techniques, including detailed photography and precise artifact recording, established new standards for archaeological publication that enabled scholars worldwide to study his discoveries in detail. The systematic investigation of Uruk by German archaeologists beginning in 1912 revealed the world's first urban centre and provided crucial evidence for understanding the origins of writing, monumental architecture, and complex political organisation. Excavations directed by Julius Jordan and later teams uncovered the earliest known examples of cuneiform writing. Massive temple complexes dating to the 4th millennium BCE, and evidence of sophisticated craft production that supported populations unprecedented in human history. The site's deep stratigraphic sequence, extending from modern surface levels down to virgin soil, provided a complete record of urban development spanning over 5 millennia. Archaeological work at Lagash, conducted by French teams from the 1870s through the 1930s, yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets that illuminated Sumerian political, economic, and social organization during the early dynastic and Ur-3 periods. The site's exceptional preservation conditions, resulting from its abandonment during the 2nd millennium BCE, provided archaeologists with complete building plans, intact artifact assemblages, and extensive written archives that could be directly correlated with specific architectural contexts. These discoveries enabled detailed reconstruction of ancient administrative procedures, religious practices, and daily life. The investigation of smaller Sumerian settlements through regional survey projects beginning in the 1950s revolutionized understanding of ancient Mesopotamian settlement patterns and population dynamics. Robert McCormick Adams's surveys in the Diyala River region and later work in southern Iraq employed systematic surface collection and site mapping techniques that reveal the density and complexity of ancient settlement networks. These surveys demonstrated that major cities like Ur and Uruk were supported by hundreds of smaller communities connected through irrigation systems, trade networks, and administrative hierarchies. Advances in archaeological science since the 1960s have provided new methods for analysing Sumerian material culture and environmental conditions. Radiocarbon dating enabled precise chronological frameworks that resolved long-standing debates about the timing of major cultural developments, while ceramic petrography revealed trade networks and technological transmission patterns that were invisible through traditional stylistic analysis. Paleobotanical studies of ancient seeds and pollen provided detailed reconstructions of agricultural practices and environmental changes that influenced Sumerian civilization's development. Contemporary scholarly debates continue to reshape understanding of Sumerian civilization's origins, development, and legacy. The relationship between indigenous Mesopotamian populations and incoming groups during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE remains contentious, with some scholars emphasizing cultural continuity from the Ubaid period, while others argue for significant population movements that introduced new technologies and social organization. Recent genetic studies of ancient human remains are beginning to provide direct evidence about population movements and cultural interactions that supplement traditional archaeological and textual sources. The interpretation of Sumerian political organization has evolved significantly as scholars have gained better understanding of cuneiform administrative texts and archaeological evidence for social stratification. Earlier reconstructions that emphasize theocratic government dominated by temple institutions have given way to more nuanced models that recognize the complex interactions between religious, military, and commercial elites. The discovery of palace archives and private business documents has revealed the importance of secular institutions and individual entrepreneurs in Sumerian economic life. Recent discoveries continue to expand knowledge of Sumerian civilization and its connections with neighboring regions. Excavations at sites like Tel Zaidan in northern Syria have revealed Mesopotamian-style architecture and artifacts dating to the 4th millennium BCE, suggesting that Sumerian cultural influence extended much farther than previously recognized. Similarly, new finds at Tepe-Sialk in Iran and Shahri Sokhta in Afghanistan demonstrate extensive trade networks that connected Sumerian cities with distant sources of raw materials and luxury goods. The application of digital technologies to Sumerian studies has transformed both archaeological investigation and textual analysis. Geographic information systems enable sophisticated analysis of settlement patterns and landscape relationships, while digital databases containing hundreds of thousands of cuneiform texts facilitate comprehensive linguistic and historical research. Three-dimensional scanning and virtual reality technologies are preserving endangered archaeological sites, and making Sumerian artifacts accessible to researchers and the public worldwide. Modern excavations employ multidisciplinary approaches that combine traditional archaeological methods with scientific techniques drawn from geology, biology, chemistry, and physics. Environmental archaeology provides detailed reconstructions of ancient climate, vegetation, and animal populations that illuminate the ecological context of Sumerian civilization. Residue analysis of pottery vessels reveals ancient diet and cooking practices, while microscopic examination of tool surfaces provides evidence for craft production techniques and trade relationships. The preservation and study of cuneiform tablets continues to yield new insights into Sumerian civilization as scholars develop improved methods for reading damaged texts and analyzing linguistic patterns. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has created online databases containing images and transliterations of hundreds of thousands of tablets, enabling collaborative research projects that would have been impossible under traditional scholarly methods. Machine learning algorithms are beginning to assist in text recognition and linguistic analysis, potentially accelerating the pace of discovery in Sumerian studies. International cooperation has become increasingly important for Sumerian archaeological research, as political instability in Iraq has threatened many important sites. UNESCO World Heritage designation has provided some protection for major archaeological areas, while international partnerships enable continued research despite difficult local conditions. The training of Iraqi archaeologists and the development of local museums ensure that Sumerian cultural heritage remains connected to its geographic origins, while contributing to global understanding of human civilization's development. The influence of Sumerian civilization on subsequent cultures continues to be revealed through comparative studies that trace the transmission of technological innovations, artistic motifs, and intellectual concepts across time and space. Recent research has demonstrated Sumerian influence on Indus Valley urban planning, Egyptian administrative practices, and Anatolian metallurgical techniques, suggesting that the world's first civilization had a much broader impact on human development than previously recognized. Educational initiatives have made Sumerian civilization increasingly accessible to non-specialist audiences through museum exhibitions, popular publications, and digital media. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, the British Museum, the Louvre, and other institutions have created comprehensive displays that present Sumerian achievements within broader contexts of human cultural development. These public programs ensure that the remarkable story of humanity's first urban civilization continues to inform and inspire contemporary audiences. The study of Sumerian civilization ultimately demonstrates the extraordinary creativity and adaptability that enabled human communities to develop complex urban societies capable of supporting tens of thousands of inhabitants through sophisticated agricultural, technological, and administrative innovations. From their revolutionary invention of writing to their masterful works of art and literature, the Sumerians established foundations for human civilization that continue to influence modern life in countless ways. Their legacy reminds us that human ingenuity, when applied systematically over generations, can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and create cultural achievements that endure across millennia. The rediscovery and ongoing study of Sumerian civilization represents one of archaeology's greatest success stories, transforming our understanding of human cultural development and revealing the deep roots of urban civilization. As new discoveries continue to emerge from the tells of southern Iraq and related sites throughout the ancient Near East, our appreciation for Sumerian achievements grows ever deeper, confirming their position as the creators of humanity's first great civilization and the founders of the urban tradition that shapes our world today.